Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I speak like this. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Alhamdulillah. It's been a while since we last met, and I noticed some of you have been with me since the morning today. Since Wise. Oh, is it weak still? Let me see. Maybe I need to. Is this better? Is this better? Is the sound still weak? Testing. Is this better now?
Yes, Ustaz.
Okay. All right. Alhamdulillah. So, let us begin, inshallah, with Ummul Kitab Al-Fatihah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin. Ar-Rahmanir-Rahim. Maliki yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdinas siratal mustaqim. Siratal ladzina an'amta 'alaihim ghairil maghdubi 'alaihim waladdallin. Amin. If you remember from our last discussion, which was several weeks ago, we basically, in broad outlines, have covered the, shall we say, in broad outlines, we have covered the general question of ethics from the religious standpoint, both Islamic and Christian, from the Greek standpoint, and we have also considered the modern standpoint as a consequence of secularization. So therefore, I decided that if we want to have maybe one or two more meetings, we would maybe discuss certain topics in which ethics may still play a role, and that is two special topics that I have in mind. One of them is, inshallah, what we will discuss tonight or today. That is the question of the state, yes, the nation state, and its relationship to morality, and secondly, the question of the market. Or economics and modern ethics. So for tonight, our discussion centers around the problems of morality or ethics, as it is centered around the state. The state is the nation state. The modern is a modern invention. Let us say that, because if we look at historically, in the West, the modern nation state succeeded the medieval Christian empire, or the medieval notion of authority, which is vested in the kings, but at the same time with the perhaps non-overlapping but most of the time overlapping magisteria of the church. That possesses its own sphere of influence over the people, which includes the secular aspects of society. So, in order for the modern nation state to come about, several things had to happen in history. According to John Rawls in his lectures on the history of political philosophy, he outlines three different origins, or rather three different reasons. Historical events that needed to occur before something like the modern nation state, which is perhaps also known as a liberal democracy, can take place. One was the result of the Reformation and the religious wars of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. What was the consequence of these religious wars? Of course, precipitated by the Reformation. Yes, Martin Luther, Zwingli, as well as John Calvin, their revolt against the Catholic tradition, their aligning with the secular princes, particularly amongst the Germanic princes, against the Roman Catholic Church, made way. I mean, after many years of warfare amongst the several factions amongst the Protestants and the Catholics, made way for toleration. Yes, what what is premised upon what we call liberty of conscience. So when we see in the 18th century, or rather the late 17th century, we see in the writings of John Locke, one of that is the treatise concerning toleration. He argues for liberty of conscience, that every individual Christian and every individual man of faith ought to be given freedom of religion. Whereas you know that previously the ecclesiastical class, the Roman Catholics, way until the modern period also, wherever they still held on to their power, uh, held what we call witch hunts and persecute people on matters of conscience, and people were tried based on matters of blasphemy and so on and so forth. So meaning to say the rise of the modern nation state and the liberal democracy that allowed for freedom of conscience, which in the end meant also freedom of religion, allowed for the possibility of a secular nation state. The second factor that led to this was the taming of royal powers. The taming of the royal powers. This one is also, interestingly, the result of several factors. Of course, we know technologically, the Reformation also became much assisted, although its ideas were already against the monopoly of the church in terms of people's conscience. The technology that greatly assisted the rise of secularization, understood in the political sense, was because of the existence of the printing press and the strategies employed by the Reformed churchmen were to write in the colloquial languages. Instead of Latin, they wrote in their own tongue, such as the German language, so as to appeal to the broad masses and therefore challenge the power that is premised upon a certain epistemology, because the church used to monopolize the ability to read the Bible, because mass was held in Latin, many of the religious services were held in Latin, and education was also the monopoly of the ecclesiastical class. Even the universities initially, centered around the study of theology and centered around although they were, amongst lawyers and such, people who filled secular roles, but generally the role of education was mainly held by the churchmen. With the establishment of the printing press, many of this is what we call the self-conscious strengthening of the church became possible. And early on, with the Renaissance and with the voyages of discovery around the world, it became possible to the voyages of discovery around the world also gave them perspective, yes, of how relative what was thought absolute in terms of their ethical and their metaphysical bearings. Nevertheless, in the taming of the royal power depended on the rise of the middle class and the rise of a strong marketplace. The rise of the strong marketplace and the rise of the companies, what we call the initial beginnings of capitalism, by the strength of the middle class, meant that they would have greater authority exerted, whereas the previous systems of the divine right of kings and the feudalistic systems depended on what we call fiefdoms, depended on the feudalistic control of the nobility and the lords. But the rise of industry, the rise of the new class of merchants and capitalist traders with their power and with their national frameworks allowed for the taming of the royal powers. And the third factor that is important in establishing the rise of the modern liberal democracy was the winning of the working classes to democracy via majority rule. Yes, we know that perhaps in the later part, yes, in the 18th and the 19th centuries, gradually the establishment of universal suffrage was becoming more pronounced. Of course, the female votes, women votes were also part and parcel of the democratization process, but certainly by including the working class within the system. Notice that despite his advances in toleration and his understanding of political theory, John Locke still considered, not that voting or suffrage is not something that is ought to be universal, but ought to be premised upon, say, ownership of land. Ownership of land was prerequisite to voting, but the later the later political philosophers, as perhaps beginning with John Stuart Mill, opted for greater and greater amount of inclusion by the several layers of society, until eventually the enlisting of the majority rule and the enlisting of the working class rendered the working together with the Reformation, liberty of conscience, the taming of the royal power, made possible also stringent limits upon the power of any individual to exert any more authority as opposed to the nation state. In terms of the political architecture, on the other hand, or the theoretical architecture, perhaps the central figure here was Thomas Hobbes. As you remember from our last meeting, we discussed Hobbes's notion of a secular leviathan, meaning to say the monopoly of power by the sovereign was established by Hobbes as something which is necessary in order to prevent all-out anarchy, to prevent an all-out war of all against all. So according to Thomas Hobbes, the ceding of one's freedom to be given to a sovereign at that time still understood mainly in say monarchical terms, including of course curbing the power of the church and making only something called a state religion, meaning of the Commonwealth, so that in order to strengthen power. So Hobbes made the theoretical mechanism of how to concentrate power in the nation state. Of course, pace Hobbes, after Hobbes, the later liberal thinkers tried to refine the criteria of this contractarian government. What we mean, of course, by contractarian government is that a government that is based on the agreement of the generality of the population, and through the idea that they would rather surrender their freedom in order to enjoy the benefits of living within civil society and the goods of civilization. So you notice, therefore, that this constant discourse, naturally, if we wish to delve into it, we can also look into the development of knowledge culture that sustain this effort. But in summary, let's just say that the story of modern politics, yes, or the story of modern political philosophy is but the story of the strengthening of the nation state, in the same way as the story of modern economics is about the strengthening of the market, and more recently the strengthening of the nation state / market, meaning to say that it became intertwined, because gradually, as the state concentrates even more and more power unto itself, as the society became more and more used to surrendering power to the state, what then happened as a result of the monopoly of force, the monopoly of armed force, the monopoly to be able to conscript society, meaning to say to make them serve the country or the nation state, and gradually, in terms of finance, to the establishment of central banks, the ability to maintain stable currency, and also gradually also surveillance under the name of security, and the development of efficient, or the development of the regime of bureaucracy and efficiency. This all made the modern nation state a very important aspect, shall we say, of our morality today. Because gradually, as we notice, the rise of the modern nation state, as it replaced the rule of the monarchs, as it replaced the rule of the church, as it replaced any, say, divine injunction, the modern secular nation state, yes, is a very radical Leviathan. And I think Hobbes got it right by calling it this biblical monster that is untamable. It has this tendency to concentrate power to itself, and allows, of course, the population to join within its system under the condition that they leave behind traces of personality as servants of the government state, as a legal being, as a legal person, shall we say, its own purpose. Of course, later day theoreticians tried to disclose the personality of this faceless being, the nation state. But many would agree amongst them that the monopoly of force, and as well as the monopoly of the several systems, the several departments within the nation state, ensured the continuous control of the population. Because gradually, in the efforts to strengthen the monopoly of force, the state would take control of the education process. The state would legislate what religion is allowed, which religion ought to be enfranchised, and which religion to be refused. And the extent of the expression of that religion is also controlled. This is somehow, perhaps, with perhaps some degree of accuracy that needs to be updated. This is somehow the general story of the European secular nation states, with some variations, because some of them did inherit, at least in structure, the transitional form. Yes, the final form would be something like perhaps the laicist government of France, meaning to say it is extremely and radically secular. It is a republic. It's gotten rid of its monarchy. It's gotten rid of the control of the church. But you have, for example, countries like Britain, in which they still preserve the monarch, but refuse of the powers of legislating, and refuse of many of the executive powers. The monarch is a mere symbol with some residual powers, and the religion, despite Anglicanism still being the government's, say, official religion, exerts no real authority on the liberty of conscience of the people. The weak state religion allows freedom of religion to take place within the society. And of course, there are several other models that we can think about. But all in all, secularization as a philosophical program has worked its way with the monopoly of force given governments. Yes. When it comes to the Is anyone? Who's still here? Is everyone here?
Yes, Ustad. The connection is not stable.
Okay, Alhamdulillah. All right, I'm sorry for the interruption. I was speaking about the morality and the nation state. So therefore, as we speak, I mean, in the previous sessions, we've spoken about the influence of secularization on morality, but we have to also bear in mind that the nation state is an important agent when it comes to inculcation of acceptable morality. And this, I think, is a clue to understanding what Professor Naqib Alatas mentions in Islam and Secularism, that the modern education systems is designed to produce good citizens. Yes, the idea is to produce good citizens, loyal servants of the state. Of course, there is another factor that Professor Alasdair McIntyre also has mentioned, that the story is not as linear as we thought it would be, because the market forces produced several other concentrations of power that challenges the democratic model, or that challenges the nation state model, and that is the rise of the oligarchic class, or the rise of the business classes that tended, I mean the capitalist class that tended towards monopoly. So this became part and parcel of the modern moral system. Yes. And so if we wish to talk about morality in our time, we have to bear in mind these mechanisms at work. It is not that these systems are say immutable or unchangeable, but trying to understand its workings is part and is the purpose of political philosophy now. Meaning to say, I mean, even as Muslims, we have to understand that political philosophy, or rather the ilmu siyasa, the science of politics in the history of the Islamic intellectual tradition, depended on the knowledge of the political forms that were at play. So during the and this is part and parcel of the knowledge of transitions and the knowledge of the different timings. So in the prophetic times, as well as in the period of the Khulafa al-Rashidin, there is a particular form of say political philosophy, if by politics we mean the sense of human governance. Gradually, as the some new properties that appeared to be more of a then the ulama outline different the understanding of political philosophy. Safi, for instance, in his Aqaid, although it is a work on theology, on leadership, and he speaks there in terms of what are the qualities that are required to install a leader, to be installed as a sovereign, and secondly, the responsibility. Yes, what is the status of electing a sovereign? Yes, it's that he establishes there in part of the maxims that the Muslims always require a leader, and the duties of the leader are so and so, and it is not necessary that the leader become or must be the person who is the most ethical, the most knowledgeable, and the most excellent amongst the people. It is sufficient, according to An-Nasafi, that the leader be somebody who possesses sovereignty or possesses rule over the society. So therefore, this is already a political philosophy, or an understanding of the political realities of the time, taking into consideration the political goods of that time. Meaning to say, what is the what are the consequences of rebelling, what is the threat of what we call anarchy, and what are the benefits of political rule, in spite of the fact that the ruler may be unjust. I mean, how to curtail it? I mean, would it be outweighed? Would the injustice of the individual ruler be outweighed by the process of say rebelling and the removal of kings and so on? So this became part and parcel of the political discussions. And later on, as the evolution or the growth of society became more dynamic, whereas previously they maintain in the works of the Aqidah that leadership must come from the Quraysh clan. Later on, as the Ottomans came to power, with the rise of the Ottomans and their ability to produce the sort of social solidarity that is required to establish justice and amongst the community and to develop civilization, therein, yes, a different set of analysis, a different set of the understanding of political realities took place. And similarly, in the Malay world, when, for example, in the historiographical works, in Malay historical works, in the early period when it was during the time of the princes and the kings and the Salatin, in which they were vigorous rulers who were trying to consolidate their powers, the scholars insist on the role of tasawwuf and the role of akhlaq for the moral and ethical development of the rulers. But later on, for example, with Raja Ali Haji of the 19th century, or rather, yes, the 19th century, there is a greater consciousness on the of city, of a sultanate, and the how rule is justifiable, and how a ruler can and ought to be deposed, and so on and so forth. So basically, taking the political and ethical relationship here tonight, we ought to be able to ask the right sort of questions for our time. Yes, and this is where the wisdom, as outlined in Islam and Secularism, in the preface of the 1998 edition of Islam and Secularism, Professor Alatas mentions that secular governments need not necessarily be opposed if the secular governments do not insist on secularization as a philosophical program. This is because there's a great, shall we say, there is a great degree of movement, and there is the great degree of variation between secular states. As I outlined, there are secular states that allow for freedom of religion and freedom of conscience, because that is how it was secured. I mean, if liberal political philosophy became the basis of that state, then freedom of association, freedom of religious conscience allows for the fostering and the development of, say, communities within the society that does not accept secularization as a philosophical program, except perhaps at a minimal level, in a way that does not challenge, say, the sovereignty of the states. But yet there are other states in which perhaps it is not, it is unfeasible because it also aligns itself with extreme secularism that might be detrimental to one's religious faith. So these are some of the considerations that we have to think about when it comes to morality and the state. And of course, since different states will have different historical trajectories, there will be differences also in the extent of religious influence, political and philosophical influence in terms of the ethics of the society. And there is also a questionable aspect in terms of the extent of the sovereignty of the state, because there are certain nations in which the the liberty of the individuals of the society is celebrated to the maximal level, and there are others that prefer that has greater monopoly of the sovereign state. Another consideration, of course, when we speak about, say, constitutional or liberal democracies, is the threat to that maintenance of liberty. I believe Karl Popper wrote a book in the early half of the 20th century called The Open Society and Its Enemies, as Open Society and Its Enemies, in which he presents the paradox of liberal democracy, toleration to be applied to any type of speech and any type of association, it will be self-undermining, because it would be, it could give rise to what the world has witnessed in the two world wars. Yes, first the rise of fascist Italy, and the second is based on the notion of national and the possible extreme ideologies premise as it is upon freedom and toleration, but yet it would undermine the open society. So what Karl Popper tried to outline in his book is how to conceive of a society that would remain open, but will be able to exercise its limits on what to tolerate and what not to tolerate. So I think there are several other matters, things of John Rawls, for example. There are several other considerations for them in order to achieve greater equality. In order to defend their position of human egalitarianism, for example, they argue that in order for equality to be able to hold within the modern nation states, you need to be able to curb the power of money to buy power. And in order for that to happen, you need to also be able to keep suspect the influences of charisma, the influences of media, and the ability to buy and influence policy by displaying expertise, and so on and so forth. These are things to consider. So this is something I think perhaps for some of us who may have been traditionally trained based on the Islamic intellectual tradition, this is some of the waqi', this is some of the realities on the ground today that they must be aware of if they wish, for example, to influence society in a positive manner. Alhamdulillah, I think that has been maybe a good 45-minute introduction to morality and the state. Why not we open the floor to some discussions or some questions, and also if you have disagreements, you may put forth. Thank you. Yes, either you can do so via the chat box, or you can unmute yourself if that feature is allowed by the organizers. Any questions? Well, I suppose while waiting for you to formulate your questions, there are several strategies that political philosophers, particularly well, period of the formation and the strengthening is I think of interest is the debate between Michel Foucault and Noam Chomsky on human nature. Although initially their discussion was on linguistics, and their discussion was on grammar and a means to define what it means to be human, gradually their discussion centered around the question of justice and politics. And the two figures tried to defend their political positions, and of course their political positions depended on their understanding of the modern nation state. And I believe Chomsky would continue refining his notion of trying to secure liberty of the individuals, and especially the spirit of his humane egalitarianism against, say, the control of power, against the control of money, and against the control of, say, surveillance, capitalism, and so on. But before that, in the 19th century, yes, Karl Marx, I suppose, presented a countercurrent to the general development of the modern nation state. And he argued forcefully and also, I suppose, convincingly and in a sophisticated fashion about the necessity of the withering of the state. That in his utopia, or in his ideal reading of history, the state would be unnecessary, and he outlines the steps through which this can be achieved, which of course, if you like, we can discuss further. I see now we already have a question in the chat. Does the morality of the states relate to happiness of the people? If so, from which dimensions? Well, of course, now when we think about this, the state is what you call it. The state is an aggregate. The state is an aggregate, which is why Professor Naqib Alatas said that we ought not to spend our energies on the labyrinths of politics and on the labyrinths of the legal battles, because the most serious aspect of the government that needs our serious attention is the aspect of education, because the vocation of the politician, or the vocation of the political leader, in truth, the ones that will house the parliaments, the ones that will determine the future of the nation, either in the parliaments or amongst those who control the market, are products of the university. The state has somehow evolved into an efficient system, an efficient mechanism that replenishes its need of ever newer, as we said, faceless servants of the state, through the mechanism of the universities, and the mechanisms of the colleges, and the mechanisms of the education system. So, will a state support happiness of its people? Well, that depends on what is the dominant framework and the dominant worldview of the policymakers, isn't it? If the dominant worldview and the dominant policymakers, and provided, of course, we do not become hostages to charisma. I mean, because every now and then, individuals who recognize that they have a power of exerting the authority, they may threaten the nation state by keeping it hostage to what their own desires were. And this basically are totalitarian, authoritarian regimes with dictators. If the state has to suffer a dictator, yes, for example, in some parts of the Middle East in the 20th century, or in some parts of Europe also, in which they have to suffer dictators, the dictators may determine where the shall we say, the resources of the state are to be funneled. And furthermore, if we suffer from a corruption of ethics among civil servants and amongst political parties and amongst those who enter into politics, I mean, if we suffer a problem of integrity, if we suffer moral corruption at the democratic level that permeates into society, what then will happen is that instead of thinking about the happiness of the people, they present a myopic vision, basically. If instead of thinking of long-term as well as short-term policies which are required to build truly sustainable and truly happy, shall we say, citizens, instead they prefer to outline projects for the enriching of individuals and those who are perhaps within the circle of care of those who staff the political systems. So the governments, but that's again interestingly, if on the other hand education is liberated, in that it became possible for the ethical teachers or the religious teachers to work in sync with the government together in developing a happy citizenry with say for example an efficient and sophisticated and advanced knowledge culture. uh, it is not inconceivable that it would be a welfare government, a government that concerns itself with the disenfranchised, will adopt the capabilities approach that tries to maximize welfare, and at the same time always cognizant of the duty of the state to its lord. So what needs to happen? I mean, if we think about it really, I mean, the liberation, I mean, in the sense of understanding this Islamization, the liberation of the nation state from its own self-worship to the worship of the Lord of the universe is not something which is impossible based on this mechanism and system, provided the energies are spent in the right sections. All right. I have another question. How do we explain to the West that Islamic politics is not the same as authoritarianism? Because especially in Indonesia, Khilafah became one of the political issues that is being used to attack Islam because it's false threat to democracy. Well, I don't know. Is it the West that needs our explaining, or is it ourselves that needs explaining? We need to understand the proper meaning of Khilafah also. There seems to be confusion and error also on the part of Muslims as to the proper meaning of Khilafah, isn't it? I mean, amongst the wisdom that Allah Subhanahu wa Taala has granted the Muslim Ummah was that out of the 4 Khulafa ar-Rashidin, yes, out of the 4 Khulafa ar-Rashidin, different methods were employed to legitimize their rule. Yes, Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq was, shall we say, elected by a consensus. He then elected Sayyidina Umar al-Khattab, or he nominated his successor. Sayyidina Umar al-Khattab would elect a council of 6, who are then to decide amongst themselves with the provisions that he set, become the successor. And then after when Sayyidina Uthman was caliph, or when Sayyidina Uthman was succeeded by Sayyidina Ali, it was again elected by the consensus of the community. So therefore, the form of the system of the Khilafah must look truly to what is the spirit of Khilafah. Yes, as opposed to the authoritarian leadership is. So I think what needs fresh rethinking on the parts of Muslims also in our time is to think about perhaps important and valid distinctions between what is a theocracy and what is a theocratic government, and what is a government that derives its principles from theology. And if we cannot distinguish between the two, then we will suffer the same route as how, you know, Western Christendom became secularized in the political sense. So if we are creative enough, I mean, if we possess the modicum of critical thinking, and we know how to prioritize our efforts and energies, and vie instead for a political culture that is influenced by theological principles, yes, gradually we can imagine improvements in the society. It's not the West that requires our time to take into consideration what the Prophet Muhammad said about what is the true inheritance of prophets. The true inheritance of prophets is knowledge. As he said, that ulama warathatul anbiya, and the anbiya do not bequeath dinar wala dirham, that what they bequeath is beneficial knowledge. And this beneficial knowledge has become has suffered neglect when the society, instead of focusing on this true inheritance of the Prophet in order to improve themselves and to improve their own leadership in themselves, they focus their entire energy, they dissipate their entire energy on securing power that is not guided by knowledge. And this is why in the writings of Professor Naqib Al-Atas, he was speaking about, first, when we speak about rule, it's is the nafsul haywaniyah. And if we cannot establish that, how are we to know that despite the political language that utilizes, perhaps several Arabic or Islamic terms, that the regime will be a just one? Yes, unless we have restored adab to its proper place. Is that all right, brother Sadiki, who asked, I think, this privately to me? Any other questions? Of course, talking politics is a bit heated, isn't it? Any other questions? Perhaps something from the hosts? Well then. Yes, last night we're doing Islam and secularism. Oh, okay, here we go. Al-Imla. If not set system in place, what political system do you think will flourish in our unprecedented political? What an Islamic scholar made in coherent discussion with those who are not well versed in Islamic studies. Yes, well, if not secular system in place. In truth, we have to know what is the basis of secular government, coupled between secularization program and secularism as what we call as an ideological secularism is an ideology. And we have to understand the conditions, say, political rule and religious rule. Now, if we can decouple this and we can understand the basis of the movements, system, yes, is something opted even by people who were not secularized in the West. Yes, it was established, the secular governments, yes, was established not on the principle of, say, it wasn't the Enlightenment thinkers or the French Revolution necessarily that meaning to say that the French Revolution had agents, certainly, yes. The French Revolution and the Enlightenment thinkers, people like Diderot, D'Alembert, the people like Voltaire, they were certainly agents of secularization, and they were as active agents of secularization. They were people who also opted for secular governments. They wanted to establish secular universities and so on and so forth. But yet, they were not the only key players behind the rise of the modern nation states. Even people who were religious in nature sought the protection of the secular state. So the modern secular state, yes, as opposed to being established via by the secular people, was also the agreement of religious people who were not secular in their worldview. So the modern secular state was established via a consensus, an overlapping consensus, that they saw that system was perhaps the best system to guarantee the rights of everyone, because no single denomination amongst themselves, at least they did not trust any of the single denomination to guarantee the right of the minority within that system, to guarantee the freedom of conscience of the other denomination. So that's why they opted for a secular state to be the sort of judge, to be the sort of impartial judge between the different religions. Yet this was not the single story, because there were other governments that maintained the official religious system, shall we say. Although secularization being at work, it became more and more diluted. But nevertheless, if there is, say, a religious system that can guarantee the right of the minorities to practice their religion and to practice their denominations, this secular, meaning to say the government of the here and now, could still be workable. And interestingly, if we look to history, no other religion, with the exception of Islam, guarantees the rights of other religions, yes, freedom to other religions, as a matter of religious principle, yes, not as a matter of tolerance, not as a matter of what you call it, not as a matter of compromise, meaning to say if we had more power, we would be abusive. But since we did not, then we tolerate them. That's not the case. Yes, in the religion of Islam, uh, the freedom of religious conscience is guaranteed. So therefore, uh, if we understand, if the people, yes, who are the agents of the modern nation states, if their minds have been Islamized, it is there are many, we can find many overlapping consensus between ourselves and those of other religious denominations, such that we can still achieve a stable working government that is productive of felicity, or rather that is productive of prosperity within the nation state. Malaysia is a very excellent example, I think. I mean, we can still have an official religion, and the government need not necessarily exercise secularization as a philosophical program, and we celebrate the freedom of other religions. Yet at the same time, the principle of the values, yes, deriving from the sultanates, because they were established based on the principle of Islam, persist. Yes, and of course this is a constant battle and discussion and a matter of moral debate. But nevertheless, this is already a working model, so as to show that a democratically elected government can sustain itself can sustain itself within a stable system that allows for freedom of religious practice. All right. Here's another one. As a Muslim, what is the limit of our participation in modern liberal democratic systems subscribed in a lot of Muslim majority countries today? Well, the limit of our participation. Of course, we know this is a question for the usulis to answer, and the fuqaha to answer also, to what extent. But we can give in general terms, isn't it? Certainly, of course, that tolerance will depend on our ability to practice religion, at least as perhaps individuals, or at least within the limits and confines of our household. Yes, meaning to say, where we are not forced to convert. Yes, where we can worship freely, and perhaps we can choose to live based on the dictates of our religion. We can educate our children, even if it's outside of the build hours, to become Muslims. Maybe the environment might be secular, but so long as freedom of conscience is allowed, and freedom of religious practice is allowed, we are allowed to marry and divorce, and so long as those freedoms are enjoyed, and we acquiesce, we can even work for the betterment of that society. We can contribute our fair share to the public goods. Yes, we can become servants of that government insofar as we provide our expertise, we provide our social contributions. We can work together in the goods which are commensurable between different ethical systems, which includes the secular ones. All right. oh, what does an Islamic scholar needs to know apart from those realities you mentioned in order to participate in coherent discussion with those who are not well versed in Islamic studies? Yes, of course, certainly this is something true. I mean, in terms of a democratic space, there is a tendency to level. A person who is well trained in the Turath will be made the equivalent or sometimes even not recognized in terms of his authority of the other citizen. It's like the ethics of social media, isn't it? That anyone can say anything that they like. So therefore, the scholar who wishes to contribute effectively within the public discourse today in order to establish his authority have to understand the role of political philosophy, meaning to say in terms of educating himself as a responsible citizen. He needs to understand the ways in which he can contribute to society, and the of course the values that are held dear by that society. Yes. All right. Do we have one more final question, or shall we call it a night? Any questions? Well then, if there are no more questions, inshallah, we will have one final discussion, I think next week perhaps, on the economics, yes, on good society and the market. Inshallah, I thank everyone for your consistency and then for your patience. And I would advise that you continue to read and to find authoritative works by our own classical scholars, as well as the modern experts on modern political theory and its relationship of ethics, if at least if you consider it to be your personal duty to do so. Inshallah. With that, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.